The abandoned mansion on Elm Street had been empty for decades, or so the townspeople believed. Behind its rotting shutters lived Cassius, a 400-year-old vampire who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of staying hidden. He fed quietly, killed discreetly, and never got involved in human affairs. Then came the pounding on his door at the stroke of midnight. A 7-year-old girl stood on his doorstep, tears streaming down her bruised face, blood on her torn dress. "Please, mister, they beat my mama real bad. She's dying and the police won't come to our part of town." What the child didn't know was that Cassius had once been a father himself, before the curse, before the hunger consumed everything human about him. And what the brutal men who'd attacked her mother didn't know was that they'd just awakened something far more dangerous than any human criminal. As Cassius looked into those pleading eyes, something stirred that he thought had died centuries ago. But could a monster truly become a protector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cassius stood frozen in the doorway, his pale hands gripping the ornate frame until the wood began to splinter. The scent of the child's fear mixed with the metallic tang of dried blood should have triggered his predatory instincts. Instead, it awakened memories he'd buried beneath centuries of calculated indifference. "What's your name?" His voice came out rougher than intended, like gravel grinding against stone. "Luna," she whispered, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "Luna Martinez. My mama, she—" A sob choked off her words. The name hit him like a physical blow. Luna, his own daughter's name, spoken in a cemetery 400 years ago as he knelt beside a tiny grave, already feeling the first stirrings of the darkness that would claim his soul within the week. "Show me," he said, stepping into the night air for the first time in months. Luna's eyes widened as moonlight revealed his true appearance. Skin like marble, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, movements that defied natural physics. But desperation overrode fear, and she grabbed his cold hand with her warm one. "This way, mister. Please, hurry." They moved through the sleeping town, past neat houses with white picket fences and manicured lawns, toward the part of town where streetlights flickered when they worked at all. With each step, the neighborhood deteriorated, paint peeling, windows boarded, hope abandoned. Luna led him down a narrow alley between two crumbling tenements. The stench of poverty and neglect filled the air, but underneath it Cassius detected something else. Violence, fresh and brutal. "Third floor," Luna panted, pulling him up a staircase that groaned under their combined weight. "Apartment 3B. The door hung open, one hinge torn from the frame. Inside, the small apartment had been destroyed, furniture overturned, dishes shattered, family photographs ground under heel. And in the center of it all, a woman lay motionless on the kitchen floor. Maria Martinez couldn't have been older than 25, but life had already carved lines around her eyes. Now those eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, her face a canvas of purple bruises. Blood pooled beneath her head where it had struck the corner of the overturned table. "Mama," Luna whispered, dropping to her knees beside the still form. "I brought help. Please wake up." Cassius knelt and placed 2 fingers against Maria's throat. The pulse was there barely, a flutter weak as a dying bird's wing. She had minutes, perhaps less. Who did this? The question emerged as a growl. "The Hutchins brothers," Luna said without hesitation. "They come every month for money Mama don't have. Tonight they got real mad 'cause she spent the rent on my medicine." She touched her chest, where Cassius could now hear the subtle wheeze of compromised lungs. The Hutchins brothers. He knew them by reputation, local enforcers who preyed on the desperate. The kind of men who beat single mothers and terrorized children, secure in the knowledge that no one would stop them. They were wrong. Cassius had fed 2 weeks ago, but the hunger was always there, lurking beneath his civilized veneer. Now it rose to the surface, not as mindless craving but as purposeful intent. For the first time in centuries, his nature aligned with something approaching justice. "Stay with your mother," he commanded, already moving toward the broken door. "Keep talking to her. Don't let her slip away." "Where are you going?" Luna called after him. He paused in the doorway, and when he turned back, his eyes held a predatory gleam that would have terrified anyone else. But Luna saw only hope. To have a conversation with the Hutchins brothers. The night air embraced him as he stepped into the alley, every sense heightened, every instinct focused. 400 years of restraint and careful control fell away like shed skin. Tonight, the monster would hunt, but for once, he would be hunting other monsters. The morning sun filtered through grimy windows as Sarah Chen hurried through her apartment, gathering scattered toys and smoothing rumpled cushions. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the familiar routine offering little comfort against the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Tommy sat at their small kitchen table, picking at a bowl of cereal while sketching monsters in the margins of his homework. "You need to eat more than that," Sarah said, forcing brightness into her voice as she glanced at the clock. 20 minutes until she had to leave for her shift at the diner, and Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 Billions wouldn't be available to watch Tommy until noon. "I'm not hungry," Tommy mumbled, not looking up from his drawing. The creature taking shape under his pencil had wild hair and sharp teeth, but somehow managed to look more protective than threatening. Sarah's phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Marcus, running late today. "See you tonight." Relief flooded through her chest. Late meant he might not show up at all, and she desperately needed the breathing room. The bruise on her ribs from 3 nights ago still ached when she moved too quickly, hidden beneath her waitress uniform, where no one would ask questions she couldn't answer. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was small. "What if we just left? Like, went somewhere else?" The question hit her like a physical blow. How many times had she asked herself the same thing during sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling while Marcus snored beside her? But leaving required money they didn't have, a car that ran for more than 10 miles, and somewhere to go that Marcus couldn't find them. "It's complicated, sweetheart." She sat beside him, running her fingers through his unruly hair. "Adults have responsibilities, jobs, leases." "The old man in 1A, Tommy said suddenly. "Nobody bothers him." Sarah's blood chilled. "Tommy, I've told you to stay away from him. He's dangerous." "But what if he's not?" Tommy's eyes were too bright, too desperate. What if everyone just thinks he is, but really he's just different? Before Sarah could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their door. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the steps slowed, then stopped. 3 sharp knocks rattled the thin wood. "Sarah, open up. I know you're in there." Marcus's voice carried the edge it always had when he'd been drinking, which lately was most of the time. Sarah glanced at the clock again. He was hours early, and that never meant anything good. "Stay here," she whispered to Tommy, who had gone pale. She moved to the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. Marcus stood in the hallway, swaying slightly, his fist raised for another round of knocking. "I'm getting ready for work," she called through the door. "Can we talk later?" "Don't play games with me." His voice was closer now, right against the door. "I saw you talking to that guy yesterday, the one from the grocery store." Sarah's mind raced. The only interaction she'd had was with the teenage cashier who'd helped her reach something on a high shelf, but explaining would only make things worse. It always did. The door handle rattled violently. "Open this door, Sarah, now!" Behind her, she heard Tommy's chair scrape against the floor. When she turned, he was standing by the window, his small hands pressed against the glass as he stared down at the courtyard below. "He's down there," Tommy whispered. "The old man. He's watching." Sarah moved to the window, peering over her son's shoulder. In the shadows between buildings, she could make out a tall figure in dark clothing. Even from 3 stories up, she could feel the weight of his gaze. The door handle rattled again, more aggressively this time. Marcus was getting impatient, which meant he was getting dangerous. "Mom," Tommy said, his voice steady despite everything. I'm going to ask him for help." No, the word came out sharper than she intended. "Tommy, you don't understand. People like that, they don't help, they take advantage." "People like Marcus help?" Tommy's question was quiet, but it cut through every excuse she'd been making, every rationalization she'd built around their situation. The pounding on the door grew louder, accompanied by Marcus shouting her name. Soon the neighbors would start complaining, or worse, someone would call the landlord. They'd already received one noise violation notice. Tommy was still staring out the window. He's not moving, just watching, like he's waiting for something. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to think through the fear clouding her judgment. Every option felt like a trap. Let Marcus in and risk another night of walking on eggshells until he found an excuse to explode. Keep him out and face his rage later when he inevitably found a way inside. "Mom," Tommy said softly, "what if the monsters we're scared of aren't the ones we should be running from?" The wisdom in her 8-year-old's words broke something inside her chest. When had her child become the adult in their relationship? When had she failed so completely that he was looking to strangers in the shadows for salvation? The child's blood called to him like a siren song, sweet and untainted by the bitter herbs of fear that usually seasoned his meals. Victor pressed his back against the stone wall of his cellar, fighting the ancient hunger that clawed at his throat. The girl sat cross-legged on his dusty floor, seemingly oblivious to the predator mere feet away. "My mama says you eat children," Lucy said matter-of-factly, picking at a loose thread on her pajama sleeve, "but I think she's wrong. If you ate children, there wouldn't be any left in the neighborhood." Victor's laugh emerged as a harsh rasp. "Your mother is wiser than you know, little one." "Maybe, but Mr. Henderson next door hurts his wife, and nobody calls him a monster." She looked up at him with those impossibly blue eyes. "I hear her crying through the walls sometimes. Do you hear her too?" The question caught him off guard. Of course, he heard Margaret Henderson's sobs, her muffled pleas, the sickening sound of flesh meeting flesh. His supernatural hearing made him privy to every dark secret in a 6-block radius. The irony wasn't lost on him that the neighborhood's greatest fear lived in peaceful solitude while real horrors played out behind lace curtains and white picket fences. "I hear many things I wish I could not," he admitted. Lucy nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. "That's why I came to you. I need help, and the grown-ups won't listen." "What makes you think I would help a human child?" "Because you haven't eaten me yet, even though I can see you're really, really hungry." She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Your hands are shaking and you keep looking at my neck, but you're not moving closer. That means you don't want to hurt me." Victor stared at her, genuinely unsettled by her perception. In 3 centuries of existence, he'd never encountered a child quite like this one. Most humans, especially the young, either fled in terror or stood frozen by his supernatural presence. Lucy seemed to view him as simply another neighbor with unusual dietary requirements. "Tell me about your father," he said finally. Her small face darkened, and for the first time she looked truly afraid. "He's getting worse. Ever since he lost his job, he drinks more, and when he drinks—" She touched her arm gingerly, and Victor caught the faint scent of old bruises beneath her sleeve. "Mama tries to protect me, but he's so much bigger than us." The hunger in Victor's throat transformed into something else entirely, a cold, familiar rage that he hadn't felt in decades. He'd spent years convincing himself that humans deserved whatever cruelty they inflicted upon each other. They were cattle, nothing more. Their suffering was simply the natural order of things. But looking at this brave, broken child, he found his carefully constructed indifference crumbling. "The police won't do anything," Lucy interrupted. "Mama called them twice. They talked to Daddy for 5 minutes, and he promised to get help. Then they left, and he got really mad that she called them." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said next time she calls, he'll give them a real reason to come." Victor closed his eyes, remembering another child from another century. Anna, his sister's daughter, bright and fearless like Lucy. He'd been away hunting when the soldiers came, when human monsters wearing the colors of church and crown had destroyed everything he'd failed to protect. "What exactly do you want from me?" he asked. "Make him stop." The words came out fierce and desperate. "I don't care how, just make him stop hurting us. You're asking me to kill your father. I'm asking you to save my mama." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Everyone's scared of you, right? Maybe if you just talked to him, showed him those teeth, he'd listen. Maybe he'd leave us alone." Victor studied the child before him, this impossible mixture of innocence and pragmatism, who'd sought out a monster because the world's other monsters wore human faces. She wasn't asking for revenge or cruelty, she was asking for protection, for someone to care enough to intervene when the systems meant to help had failed. "If I do this," he said slowly, "there will be consequences. Your father, he may not simply listen and reform his ways." "I know." Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mama says sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse. Is it worse for him to hurt us, or for us to be hurt?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would reshape everything Victor thought he understood about monsters and men. Outside, the night wind rattled the windows of his underground sanctuary, as if the darkness itself was waiting for his answer. The scent of fear clung to the child like morning dew, impossible to ignore. Lucian stood motionless in the doorway of his manor, studying the small figure huddled on his doorstep. The boy couldn't be more than 10, all sharp elbows and hollow cheeks, his clothes hanging like rags on his thin frame. Dark bruises painted his pale skin in violent purples and yellows, and dried blood crusted beneath his nose. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the dead leaves across the cobblestones. "I know what you are. Everyone says you're the monster in the big house, but I need help." Lucian's nostrils flared. The metallic tang of blood mixed with something else. Desperation so pure it made his ancient heart clench unexpectedly. He should have slammed the door shut, retreated to the shadows where he belonged. Instead, he found himself stepping aside. "Enter." The boy scrambled inside, his bare feet silent on the marble floor. Lucian closed the door with deliberate slowness, listening to the rapid flutter of the child's heartbeat. When he turned, he found wide brown eyes staring up at him without the terror he'd grown accustomed to seeing in mortal faces. "What is your name?" Lucian asked, his voice carefully modulated to avoid the predatory growl that lurked beneath the surface. "Tommy." The boy wiped his nose with the back of his hand, smearing more blood. "Tommy Fletcher." Fletcher. The name stirred something in Lucian's memory. Whispers he'd caught on night winds, fragments of conversations from the townspeople below, a family struggling, a father who drank too much, neighbors who turned blind eyes to screams in the night. "Who hurt you?" The question emerged before Lucian could stop it, surprising them both with its gentle tone. Tommy's thin shoulders shook. "My pa, he's getting worse. Ever since Ma died, he drinks, and when he gets angry—" The boy's voice trailed off, but his battered face told the rest of the story. Lucian felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He'd witnessed countless acts of human cruelty over his centuries of existence, had committed more than his share of monstrous deeds. Yet something about this broken child stirred memories he'd buried deep, echoes of his own mortality, his own desperate pleas for help that had gone unanswered until darkness claimed him entirely. "Why come to me?" Lucian moved closer, noting how Tommy didn't flinch away. "Surely there are others who could—" "There ain't nobody else," Tommy's voice cracked. "The sheriff's pa's drinking buddy. Mrs. Henderson next door pretends she don't hear nothing. The priest says children should honor their fathers no matter what." His small hands clenched into fists. "But I heard the stories about you. They say you're powerful, that you could stop anyone if you wanted to." The irony wasn't lost on Lucian. A child seeking protection from a creature who had spent centuries preying on the innocent. He studied Tommy's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only raw honesty and bone-deep exhaustion. "They also say I drink blood and steal souls," Lucian said quietly. "Does that not frighten you?" Tommy considered this with the gravity only children facing impossible choices could muster. "My past steals my soul every day. Maybe yours is cleaner than his." The words hit Lucian like a physical blow. He turned away, staring through the tall windows at the darkness beyond. In the glass, his reflection was barely visible, a pale spectre caught between worlds. When had he last felt anything beyond hunger or boredom? When had another's suffering mattered more than his own desires? "What would you have me do?" he asked, still facing the window. "I don't know." Tommy's voice was small now, uncertain. "Make him stop, maybe? Or make it so he can't hurt my little sister when she gets older? She's only 3, but I see how he looks at her sometimes, and I'm scared." Lucian's hands clenched at his sides. The casual mention of a sister, an even more vulnerable child, sent something dark and protective surging through his veins. Not hunger, something else entirely, something he'd thought died with his humanity centuries ago. He turned back to Tommy, seeing the boy with new eyes. Not prey, not an annoyance, but a guardian barely old enough to tie his own shoes, carrying burdens that would break grown men. "You would risk everything coming here," Lucian said. "What if the stories are true? What if I am the monster they claim?" Tommy met his gaze steadily. "Then you'd still be better than him." The simple truth of it settled over Lucian like a mantle he'd forgotten how to wear. For the first time in centuries, he felt the weight of choice, real choice, pressing down on his shoulders. He could send the boy away, retreat to his comfortable isolation. Or he could remember what it meant to be something other than a predator in the darkness. Outside, storm clouds gathered, and somewhere in the town below, a little girl waited for her brother to come home. The basement had become my sanctuary and my prison in equal measure. 3 days had passed since the child, Emma, had stumbled into my world with her desperate plea. 3 days of fighting every instinct that screamed at me to simply take what I needed and be done with this complication. I pressed my back against the stone wall, feeling the familiar bite of cold seep through my clothing. The hunger gnawed at me like a living thing, a constant companion that grew more insistent with each passing hour. My last feeding had been over a week ago, and even then, I'd been careful to take only what I needed from a vagrant who wouldn't be missed. The old ways demanded more, but I'd learned to make do with less over the decades of self-imposed exile. Above me, I could hear the muffled sounds of the family's evening routine. Footsteps across the kitchen floor, the soft murmur of voices, the distant sound of water running in pipes. Normal, human sounds that should have meant nothing to me, yet I found myself listening for Emma's lighter tread among them, the musical quality of her voice when she spoke to her mother. This was madness. I was Adrian Blackthorne, who had walked through centuries of darkness, who had once commanded fear from mortals across 3 continents. I had survived the Great Fire of London by feeding on the chaos, had stalked the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian England like a shadow given form. I was not meant to cower in basements, concerned about the welfare of humans. But Emma was different. When she'd looked at me with those impossibly trusting eyes, something had shifted in the carefully constructed walls I'd built around what remained of my humanity. She saw me not as a monster to be feared, but as someone who might help her, someone who might save her family. I closed my eyes and allowed my enhanced hearing to extend beyond the house. The neighborhood was settling into night, but I could detect the sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps that lingered too long on sidewalks, the creak of a car door opening 2 houses down, whispered conversations that carried undertones of violence. They were watching. The men who wanted this house, this land, this family's destruction. I'd been tracking their movements since Emma's visit, learning their patterns, counting their numbers. 5 of them, rotating in shifts, believing themselves invisible to the family they stalked. If they only knew what else was watching them in return. A soft scratching at my door interrupted my surveillance. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more, the pattern Emma had insisted upon when she'd somehow convinced me to let her return. I should have refused, should have sent her away and never allowed this connection to form. Instead, I found myself opening the door to her earnest face and bright eyes. "I brought you something," she whispered, holding out a thermos. "Mama made soup, and I thought, well, I know you probably don't eat soup, but it's warm, and you always seem so cold down here." The gesture was so purely innocent, so utterly human in its kindness, that I felt something crack inside my chest. When was the last time someone had thought of my comfort? When had anyone ever offered me warmth without expecting something in return? "That's very thoughtful," I managed, accepting the thermos, though we both knew I had no use for it. "How is your mother?" Emma's expression dimmed slightly. "Better. She's been getting up more, helping around the house, but she still cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. And today there was another man who came to the door. He was different from the others, nicer, but in a way that felt wrong, like he was pretending." I nodded, having observed that particular visit from my hidden vantage point. The man had been smooth, professional, speaking in gentle tones about offers and opportunities, but his eyes had been cold, calculating. He'd been measuring the house, the exits, the windows, cataloguing weaknesses. "Emma," I said carefully, "has your mother made any decisions about moving?" The child shook her head firmly. "She says this is our home, and Daddy wouldn't want us to give up. She says we're staying no matter what." Pride and worry warred in her young voice. "That's good, right? That we're staying?" I thought of the men outside, of their growing impatience, of the escalating pattern of intimidation I'd observed. I thought of the fragility of the woman upstairs and the determination of those who wanted her gone. "Yes," I lied smoothly. "That's very good." But as Emma smiled and made her way back upstairs, I was already calculating. The men wouldn't wait much longer. Soon, subtle pressure would give way to direct action, and when that happened, this child and her grieving mother would find themselves facing something far more dangerous than any creature of the night. Perhaps it was time to remind the neighborhood why my house had remained empty for so long, and why certain shadows were best left undisturbed. The scent of fear clung to Marcus like a second skin as he retreated to his sanctuary beneath the Victorian manor. The basement stretched far deeper than any human blueprint would suggest, carved from earth and stone by his own hands across centuries of solitude. Here, surrounded by the musty embrace of darkness, he could think without the distraction of Emily's pleading eyes or the thunderous rhythm of her small heart. He had not fed in 3 days. The hunger gnawed at him with increasing intensity, a living thing that coiled through his veins like liquid fire. His reflection in the antique mirror across the room wavered, showing glimpses of what he truly was beneath the carefully maintained facade. Pale skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, eyes that burned with an unholy light, and beneath his lips, the promise of death in ivory points. Marcus pressed his palms against the cool stone walls, feeling the weight of earth above him. 237 years of existence had taught him patience, but this child, this fragile, broken creature, had shattered something in his carefully constructed world. She had looked at him without fear, had spoken to him as if he were capable of salvation rather than damnation. The irony was not lost on him, a monster seeking to protect the innocent from other monsters. Above, he could hear the familiar creaking of the house settling, but underneath that, something else. Voices, multiple sets of footsteps on his front porch, heavy and deliberate. Through the enhanced senses that came with his curse, he caught fragments of conversation carried on the night wind. "Sure this is the right house? Kid said she came here, crazy little thing, making up stories about talking to the old man. Place gives me the creeps. Always has." Marcus felt his jaw clench as recognition dawned. Ray Brennan's voice, thick with alcohol and malice. The man had come looking for Emily, and he hadn't come alone. The vampire closed his eyes, extending his supernatural hearing further. 3 heartbeats on the porch, 2 more lingering by the gate, 5 men in total, all carrying the metallic scent of weapons. A sharp knock echoed through the house, followed by Ray's voice, artificially jovial but edged with violence. "Evening. Sorry to bother you so late, but we're looking for a little girl. about 8 years old, blonde hair. She wandered off and we're worried sick about her. Marcus remained motionless in his basement sanctuary, every instinct screaming at him to either flee or attack. Neither option would help Emily. If he ran, these men would search the house and likely find her huddled in whatever corner she'd chosen to hide. If he killed them, and the hunger made that option increasingly appealing, others would come. Questions would be asked. His carefully maintained existence would crumble. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "We know someone's in there. Saw lights earlier." A pause, then Ray's voice dropped its pretense of politeness. "Look, we're not leaving without the girl. We can do this easy or we can do this hard." The sound of shattering glass drifted down from above. They were breaking in. Marcus felt the familiar transformation beginning, his body responding to the threat with predatory efficiency, his canines elongated, his fingernails hardened into claws, and the world sharpened into crystalline focus. The basement suddenly seemed too small to contain what he was becoming. But then another sound reached him, a soft whimper from somewhere above. Emily trying to muffle her terror and failing. The child was alone up there with armed men who meant her harm, and she had nowhere left to run. The realization struck him like a physical blow. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Marcus found himself faced with a choice that had nothing to do with his own survival. He could protect Emily, but doing so would mean revealing what he truly was. It would mean crossing a line he had spent decades drawing in the sand. Heavy footsteps moved through his house, boots scraping against hardwood floors he had installed with his own hands 60 years ago. Furniture crashed as the intruders grew bolder, their search becoming more destructive. "Check upstairs," Ray barked. "She's got to be here somewhere." Marcus looked at his reflection one final time, seeing the monster staring back at him with burning eyes. Perhaps Emily had been wrong about him. Perhaps he was exactly what the neighborhood whispered he was, a creature of nightmare and shadow. But if that were true, then these men had made a grave error in bringing violence to his door. The vampire smiled, revealing fully extended fangs, and began to climb the stairs toward the sound of Emily's muffled sobs. Tonight, for the first time in his long existence, he would not hunt for hunger alone. Tonight, he would hunt for something far more dangerous: justice. The real monsters, it seemed, were about to learn what true terror looked like. The basement had become a war room of sorts. Though Lucian doubted any general had ever planned strategy while fighting the urge to drain his tiny consultant dry, Emma sat cross-legged on the musty carpet, her bruised face illuminated by the single bare bulb overhead, sketching crude diagrams of her house layout with a stub of pencil on the back of an old envelope. "The kitchen window doesn't lock properly," she said, pointing to her drawing with the seriousness of a military strategist. "Sometimes I climb out when Randy's really mad. There's a big oak tree right next to it." Lucian studied the child's artwork, noting the meticulous detail with which she'd marked every door, every room, every potential escape route. No 8-year-old should possess such intimate knowledge of hiding places and exit strategies. The thought sent another wave of that strange, protective fury coursing through his veins. "And your mother?" he asked, settling onto the floor across from her, careful to maintain distance. Even now, hours after feeding, her pulse called to him like a siren song. Where would she be during the day? Emma's pencil stilled. She works at the diner on Maple Street, double shifts most days since Randy moved in, says we need the money for his medicine. The way she said the word made it clear she understood exactly what kind of medicine Randy required. He doesn't work? Used to. Before he started drinking the bad stuff that makes him mean. Emma looked up at him then, those 2 knowing eyes searching his face. "Are you really going to help us?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with desperate hope. Lucian had existed for 8 centuries, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had seen humanity at its most noble and most depraved. He told himself long ago that mortal affairs were beneath his concern, that their brief lives were inconsequential flickers in the vast darkness of time. So why did this child's pain feel like a physical weight in his chest? I gave you my word, he said finally. Emma nodded solemnly, as if his promise were a sacred thing. Perhaps to her it was. Randy usually passes out around midnight. That's when I sneak down to get food sometimes. The floorboard by the couch creaks really loud, so you have to step over it. Emma, Lucian's voice was gentler than he'd intended. What happens when your mother comes home? Does she know how he treats you? The child's face crumpled for just a moment before she rebuilt her mask of stoic acceptance. She knows. She says Randy loves us in his own way, that he's trying to get better, that if I just stayed out of his way more, maybe he wouldn't get so angry. The pencil snapped in Lucian's grip. Emma stared at the broken pieces, then at his hands, where dark veins had begun to show beneath pale skin. She should have been terrified. Instead, she leaned forward with curious concern. Does it hurt, getting angry like that? The innocence of the question nearly undid him. Here was a child who'd known more pain in her 8 years than most adults experienced in a lifetime, and she was worried about his discomfort. Sometimes, he admitted, forcing his features back to human semblance, but not the way you might think, because you're not really human. It wasn't a question. She'd accepted his nature with the same matter-of-fact resignation she showed everything else. Monsters were simply another fact of life for Emma Walsh. No, I'm not. Are you going to kill Randy? The directness of it caught him off guard. He'd killed countless humans over the centuries, most for far less provocation than Randy had provided. It would be simple, clean, one fewer predator prowling the night. But something in Emma's expression gave him pause. Hope warred with fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of what his answer might reveal about the world she lived in. Would you want me to? He asked carefully. She was quiet for a long time, drawing absent circles on the envelope with what remained of her pencil. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I used to think about it, when he'd hit Mama, or when he'd... She trailed off, shaking her head. But then I'd feel bad for thinking it. Mama says bad thoughts make you a bad person. Your mother is wrong about many things, it seems. Emma's laugh was bitter, too old for her years. Yeah, maybe. She looked up at him again. I just want him to go away. I want him to leave us alone. Is that bad? No, little one. That's not bad at all. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but Lucian could feel the approaching day like a weight on his shoulders. Soon he would need to retreat to the darkness, to leave this child to face another day in her prison of broken promises and justified violence. But not forever. The rain hammered against the windows of the old Victorian house as Lucian paced the length of his drawing room, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug despite his agitation. 3 nights had passed since his encounter with little Emma, and her desperate plea echoed in his mind like a broken record. The child's tear-streaked face haunted him in ways that centuries of genuine horrors never had. He paused before the tall mirror that dominated the far wall, its ornate frame reflecting nothing but an empty room. The absence of his reflection had long since ceased to disturb him, but tonight it felt particularly fitting. What was he, after all, but an absence? A void where compassion should live, a creature that had forgotten what it meant to feel anything beyond hunger. Yet the child had stirred something in him, something he'd thought permanently buried beneath decades of calculated indifference. A soft knock at the front door interrupted his brooding. Lucian's enhanced senses immediately identified the visitor. Rapid heartbeat, the scent of fear and desperation, and underneath it all, the familiar sweetness of youth. Emma had returned. He found her huddled on his doorstep, soaked through and shivering. Her small hands clutched a worn teddy bear, and fresh bruises decorated her thin arms like twisted jewelry. The sight sent an unexpected surge of rage through him, not the familiar bloodlust he knew so well, but something far more protective and infinitely more dangerous. He hurt Mama again, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Real bad this time. She won't wake up and I don't know what to do. Lucian's jaw clenched as he knelt to her level, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. The acrid smell of violence clung to her clothes, mixed with the metallic tang of blood that wasn't her own. His vampire nature responded immediately to the scent, fangs threatening to extend, but he forced himself to remain controlled. "Where is your stepfather now?" he asked, his voice carefully modulated to hide the fury building within him. "He went to the bar. He always goes to the bar after—" She trailed off, unable to voice the horror she'd witnessed. The neighbor lady called the police, but they just talked to him and left. They didn't even look at Mama real good. He told them she fell down the stairs again. The words hit Lucien like physical blows. He'd witnessed humanity's capacity for cruelty throughout his long existence, but there was something particularly vile about violence against those who couldn't defend themselves. At least his victims had usually been able to fight back, however futilely. "Come inside," he said gently, extending his hand. "You'll catch your death in this weather." Emma hesitated for only a moment before taking his cold fingers in her small, warm ones. The trust implicit in that gesture nearly undid him. When had anyone last trusted him so completely? When had he last deserved such faith? He led her to the kitchen, wrapping her in an old blanket, while he prepared hot chocolate with hands that remembered the motions from a life lived centuries ago. The domestic normalcy of the act felt surreal, like playing house with the ghost of the man he'd once been. "Why are you helping me?" Emma asked, cradling the warm mug between her palms. "Everyone says you're scary." Lucien considered the question, surprised by its complexity. Why was he helping her? The logical answer was that he wasn't, not yet anyway. He'd offered shelter and hot chocolate, nothing more, but even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. Something fundamental had shifted the moment she'd knocked on his door that first night. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that look most human." Emma nodded with a solemn wisdom that only children forced to grow up too quickly possessed. "He looks normal to everyone else. That's why nobody believes us." The simple statement crystallized Lucien's decision. He'd spent decades viewing humans as nothing more than prey, dismissing their individual struggles as irrelevant to his existence. But this child had reminded him of something he'd forgotten, the difference between taking life and protecting it. Rising from his chair, Lucien moved to the window and gazed out into the storm-lashed night. Somewhere in the darkness, a violent man was drinking away his sins, confident that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to hurt those weaker than himself. The thought filled Lucien with a cold determination he hadn't felt in decades. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. Lucien turned back to her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt purpose flowing through his undead veins. The monster everyone feared was about to become exactly what this child needed, not despite his nature, but because of it. "Now," he said quietly, "we make sure your stepfather can never hurt you or your mother again." The morning sun cast long shadows through Elena's kitchen window as she prepared breakfast with trembling hands. 3 days had passed since Marcus first appeared at their door, and the house felt different now, safer, yet charged with an electricity that made her skin prickle. She could hear him moving about the basement, the soft scrape of furniture being rearranged, the whisper of pages turning. Elena's spoon clinked against her coffee cup. "Some people work different hours, Mija, like how Papa used to work late shifts at the factory. But Marcus doesn't go to work, and he's really pale and cold." Sophia's dark eyes held that peculiar intensity children possessed when they sensed adult secrets. "Is he sick?" Before Elena could formulate an answer, the basement door creaked open. Marcus emerged, moving with that fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. He wore a different shirt today, still black but cleaner, as if he'd made an effort to appear more presentable. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying that same careful formality. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Elena gestured toward the table. "Would you like some coffee? I made extra." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or a shadow of old longing. "That's kind of you, but I don't typically partake in morning beverages." Sophia giggled. "You talk funny." like the people in those old movies Mama watches. Marcus tilted his head, studying the child with curious intensity. And what do you think of those old movies? They're okay. The ladies have pretty dresses, but the men are always so serious. She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. Like you. A smile ghosted across Marcus's lips, the first genuine expression of warmth Elena had witnessed from him. Perhaps that's simply how some of us were taught to be. The moment shattered as tires crunched on gravel outside. Elena's body went rigid, coffee cup forgotten in her hands. Through the window she glimpsed Derek's rusted pickup truck lurching to a stop beside the mailbox. He's early, she whispered, more to herself than to them. Marcus moved to the window in one fluid motion, his casual demeanor evaporating. His shoulders tensed as he observed Derek stumbling from the truck, already unsteady on his feet, despite the early hour. "Sophia, go to your room," Elena commanded, her voice sharp with fear. "But I haven't finished." "Now." The child obeyed, casting a worried glance at Marcus before disappearing down the hallway. Heavy footsteps thundered across the porch, followed by aggressive pounding on the front door. "Elena, open this damn door. We need to talk." Elena's hands shook as she smoothed her hair, checking her reflection in the kitchen window. "I have to answer it. If I don't, he'll just get angrier." Marcus stepped into her path, his pale eyes holding depths of shadow she'd never noticed before. "You don't have to do anything. This is your home. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." His voice carried an edge that made the air itself seem to thicken. "I've witnessed this particular brand of cruelty for centuries. Men who believe fear gives them ownership over others." The pounding intensified, rattling the doorframe. "Elena, I know you're in there. Don't make me break this door down." "Please," Elena whispered, touching Marcus's arm. The coldness of his skin sent a jolt through her fingertips. "Just let me handle this. Don't let him see you." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded curtly and melted into the shadows beside the refrigerator, becoming so still he seemed to vanish entirely. Elena forced herself to walk to the front door, each step feeling like a small death. She unlocked the deadbolt with fingers that betrayed her terror and pulled the door open just wide enough to see Derek's flushed face. "There you are." He reeked of stale beer and something sharper, whiskey maybe or vodka. "Why the hell didn't you answer faster? I was making breakfast." "What do you want, Derek?" He pushed against the door, but she held it firm. "What do I want? I want to see my daughter. I want to know why you've been filling her head with lies about me. I haven't told her anything." "Bullshit. Kids don't just decide they hate their fathers for no reason." His bloodshot eyes narrowed. "You've been talking to lawyers? Planning to take her away from me?" "I would never." "You would never what? Try to poison my own kid against me?" He shoved the door harder, forcing Elena back a step. "I think we need to discuss your attitude problem, sweetheart." From somewhere in the shadows of the kitchen, Elena heard the softest whisper of movement, like silk brushing against stone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Derek stepped across the threshold, and Elena knew with sinking certainty that something terrible was about to unfold. The scent of fresh blood hung in the air like a copper bell, resonating through Cassius's heightened senses as he crouched in the shadows of the Hendricks house. 3 hours had passed since he'd slipped inside through the basement window, and now he waited with the patience of centuries, listening to the family's evening routine unfold above him. But it wasn't Marcus's blood that called to him tonight, though the temptation pulsed like a second heartbeat in his chest. No, the metallic sweetness came from something else entirely, evidence that would soon paint a very different picture than the one Detective Morrison believed. Cassius had spent the daylight hours in ways that would have impressed even the most dedicated investigator. While his body lay in the death-like sleep of his kind, his network of creatures had been busy. Rats that could slip through the smallest spaces, birds that saw everything from above, and yes, even the occasional cooperative human who owed him favors from decades past. The basement door creaked open, and Marcus's voice drifted down. "Emma, "Did you hear something down there?" "Probably just the old pipes," she called back, but Cassius heard the underlying tension in her voice. Good. Fear would make what came next easier. Marcus's footsteps descended, each step accompanied by the soft whisper of his hand sliding along the banister. Cassius pressed himself deeper into the alcove behind the furnace, becoming one with the darkness. The man's flashlight beam swept across the basement, illuminating dust motes and cobwebs, but missing the ancient predator entirely. "Just checking things out," Marcus muttered to himself, but his voice carried the edge of a man whose conscience wasn't entirely clear. As Marcus moved closer to the workbench in the corner, Cassius smiled. Everything was positioned exactly as he'd arranged it. The small digital camera, barely visible behind a paint can. The manila envelope tucked beneath a stack of old magazines. And most importantly, the cell phone, Tommy's cell phone, which Morrison's investigation had somehow failed to recover. Marcus's flashlight beam found the envelope first. He froze, the light wavering slightly in his grip. Cassius could hear the man's heartbeat accelerate, smell the sudden spike of adrenaline mixed with something else. Guilt. With trembling fingers, Marcus pulled out the photographs. Even from his hiding place, Cassius could see them clearly, images that told a story far more damning than anything Morrison had imagined. Not just evidence of the loan shark operation, but proof of what happened to people who couldn't pay. What had happened to Tommy's father all those years ago. A strangled sound escaped Marcus's throat as he flipped through the pictures. His hands shook as he found the final photograph, one taken just days ago, showing him meeting with Vincent Caruso behind the old textile mill. The same Vincent Caruso whose business associates had been asking uncomfortable questions about missing money. "No," Marcus whispered, but his denial carried no conviction. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The phone buzzed in his other hand, and Marcus nearly dropped both items. Tommy's phone, displaying a text message sent from beyond the grave. "They know about the missing 30,000, about what you did to my dad, about what you're planning to do to us." Cassius had crafted that message carefully, each word designed to strip away the last of Marcus's composure. The man's breathing became ragged, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the basement walls as panic set in. Above them, Emma called down again. "Marcus? What's taking so long? Just give me a minute," he called back, but his voice cracked on the words. Cassius chose that moment to step from the shadows, moving with supernatural silence until he stood directly behind the trembling man. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the entire basement. 30 pieces of silver, Marcus. Isn't that the traditional price for betrayal?" Marcus spun around, the flashlight beam catching Cassius full in the face, but instead of the monstrous visage the man might have expected, he saw only disappointment. Ancient, terrible disappointment. "Though in your case," Cassius continued, his pale eyes reflecting the light like a cat's, "the price was considerably higher. $30,000 to be precise. Money that never belonged to you. Money that cost a good man his life and left his son an orphan." The flashlight slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers, clattering across the concrete floor. In the sudden darkness, only Cassius's eyes remained visible, burning like cold stars. "Now then," the vampire said softly, "shall we discuss what happens next?" The scent of fear hung thick in the autumn air as Victor crouched on the fire escape outside the Delacroix apartment. Through the thin walls, he could hear Marcus pacing, his heavy boots creating a rhythm of menace across the wooden floors. Sarah's muffled sobs drifted through the darkness, punctuated by Tommy's whispered attempts to comfort his mother. Victor's fingers tightened on the rusted metal railing. The hunger gnawed at him constantly now. 3 weeks without feeding had left him weakened, his usual control fraying at the edges. Every heartbeat from within the apartment called to him like a siren song, but he forced himself to focus on the promise he'd made to the boy. The front door slammed open and Marcus emerged onto the street below. Victor watched as the man stumbled slightly, alcohol heavy on his breath, even from this distance. Good. Drunk meant careless, and careless meant vulnerable. Victor dropped silently to the alley below, his movements fluid despite his weakened state. He had fed on countless victims over the centuries, but this would be different. This wouldn't be about hunger or survival, this would be justice. Following at a distance, Victor trailed Marcus through the maze of narrow streets. The man stopped at Murphy's Tavern, a grimy establishment that reeked of stale beer and broken dreams. Through the windows, Victor watched Marcus order whiskey, his hands already unsteady from whatever he'd consumed earlier. Time crawled by as Victor waited in the shadows across the street. Pedestrians passed, their warm blood calling to him, but he remained focused. When Marcus finally stumbled out near midnight, Victor was ready. The man took a shortcut through Riverside Park, just as Victor had hoped. The ancient vampire moved like mist between the trees, staying just out of sight until Marcus reached the old stone bridge that crossed the creek. Perfect, isolated, private, Marcus Delacroix. The man spun around, nearly losing his balance on the moss-slick stones. His bloodshot eyes struggled to focus in the darkness. "Who's there?" "Show yourself." Victor stepped into the pale moonlight, filtering through the canopy above. He allowed his true nature to surface slightly. Eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian, skin that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. "You know who I am," Victor said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made Marcus's knees buckle. "You've heard the whispers, the warnings." Marcus's hand fumbled for the knife he always carried, but his coordination was shot. The blade clattered onto the bridge stones. "You're him, the thing that lives in the old house." "I am." Victor moved closer, each step deliberate and predatory. "And you've been hurting what's mine." "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came automatically, even as terror stripped away Marcus's bravado. Victor's hand shot out faster than human eyes could follow, gripping Marcus by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The man's feet kicked uselessly as Victor held him suspended over the creek below. "Sarah, Tommy, my territory, my protection." Each word dripped with centuries of accumulated menace. "You've violated both." Marcus clawed at Victor's iron grip, gasping for air. They're my family, my business." "No longer." Victor's fangs extended, gleaming white in the moonlight. The scent of Marcus's blood was intoxicating this close, rich with adrenaline and alcohol, pulsing just beneath the surface of his skin. It would be so easy to feed, to drain him dry and leave his corpse for the river. But as Victor prepared to bite, he heard something that made him pause, footsteps on the path behind them. A late-night jogger probably, or someone walking their dog. Human witnesses meant complications, questions, investigations that could lead back to Sarah and Tommy. More importantly, it would make him no different from the monster he was supposed to be protecting them from. Victor's grip tightened, cutting off Marcus's air supply completely. The man's struggles grew weaker as consciousness began to fade. Victor leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "You have one chance. Leave this city tonight. Never come back. If I see you again, if you contact Sarah or Tommy in any way, I will hunt you down and show you horrors that will make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams." He released his grip, allowing Marcus to crash onto the bridge stones. The man gasped and wheezed, clutching his bruised throat. "But they need me," Marcus wheezed. "Sarah can't make it alone." Victor crouched beside him, his presence radiating predatory menace. "She's stronger without you. They both are. You're poison, Marcus. A disease. And I'm the cure." The jogger's footsteps were getting closer. Victor stood, melting back into the shadows between the trees. His voice followed Marcus like an echo from the grave. 24 hours. Then I come for you." When the jogger finally reached the bridge, they found only Marcus Delacroix, trembling and broken, staring into the darkness with the hollow eyes of a man who had glimpsed his own mortality. The warehouse reeked of stale cigarettes and motor oil, its broken windows casting jagged shadows across the concrete floor. Victor moved through the darkness like smoke, his enhanced senses cataloguing every heartbeat, every nervous breath of the men who thought they owned this place. 3 of them lounged around a card table, assault rifles within easy reach, while 2 more patrolled the perimeter with the casual arrogance of predators who had never encountered anything more dangerous than themselves. They had no idea death had already entered their domain. Marcus Graves sat in the center of it all, his bulk spilling over a reinforced chair as he barked orders into a burner phone. The man's heart hammered with the rhythm of paranoia and stimulants, his blood carrying the bitter tang of methamphetamines and barely controlled rage. Victor had tasted such blood before. It always left him feeling polluted, as if the corruption in their souls could somehow seep into his own ancient essence. "I don't care what it takes," Graves snarled into the phone. "That family thinks they can embarrass me, make me look weak. Find them, all of them." Victor's fingers tightened around the photograph in his coat pocket, little Sarah's school picture that her mother had given him. The child's innocent smile seemed to burn against his cold skin, a reminder of everything he had once been before the hunger consumed him. For centuries, he had fed on the weak, the helpless, the innocent. But standing in this den of human monsters, he felt something shift inside him like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. The first guard never saw him coming. One moment the man was lighting a cigarette by the loading dock, the next he was slumping to the ground, unconscious but alive. Victor had learned restraint over the decades, though it went against every predatory instinct screaming in his veins. Tonight he would be precise. Tonight he would be justice rather than vengeance. The second guard turned just as Victor emerged from the shadows, his mouth opening to shout a warning. But no sound escaped his lips as Victor's hand found his throat, applying just enough pressure to cut off consciousness without crushing the fragile human windpipe. The man crumpled beside his companion, their weapons now useless metal in Victor's pale hands. "Rodriguez? Williams? Check in!" Graves's voice cracked with the first hint of fear, though he tried to mask it with bluster. "I said check in, damn it!" Victor smiled, his fangs catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. He had always enjoyed this part, the moment when his prey realized they were no longer the apex predators they believed themselves to be. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't hunting for sustenance or even pleasure. Tonight, he was hunting for something far more foreign to his nature: righteousness. The remaining 3 men scrambled for their weapons as Victor stepped into the pool of light surrounding their makeshift command center. Their hands shook as they raised their rifles, though whether from fear or chemical dependency, Victor couldn't tell. It hardly mattered. "Graves," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "we need to discuss your recent targeting of the Morrison family." Marcus Graves's face went through a fascinating array of colors: confusion, disbelief, then a sickly pallor as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. The vampire made no effort to appear human now. His skin was marble white, his movements too fluid, too predatory for anything that had ever drawn breath. When he smiled, his fangs gleamed like ivory daggers. "What the hell are you?" Graves whispered, his bravado cracking like old paint. "I am what your nightmares whisper about in the dark," Victor replied, taking a single step forward. "I am the monster that monsters fear, and you have made the catastrophic error of threatening someone under my protection." One of Graves's men opened fire, the muzzle flash strobing through the warehouse like violent lightning. Victor moved between the bullets, his form blurring beyond human perception. The rifle was in his hands before the gunman could process what had happened, the metal crumpling like tissue paper between his fingers. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the sudden, sharp scent of human terror. "You see, Marcus," Victor continued conversationally, as if automatic weapons fire was merely a minor interruption, "I have existed for 800 years. In that time, I have witnessed every form of human cruelty imaginable. I have participated in most of them, but there is something particularly vile about those who prey upon children, who threaten the innocent for sport or profit." He closed the distance between them in an instant, his hand wrapping around Graves's throat with the gentleness of a lover and the implied strength of a steel cable. The man's pulse fluttered against his palm like a trapped bird, each beat a countdown to judgment. "Sarah Morrison is 7 years old," Victor whispered, his breath cold against Graves's ear. "Her only crime was having a mother brave enough to testify against your operation. What do you think an appropriate response to that might be?" The safe house smelled of disinfectant and fear. Sarah clutched Tommy's hand as they sat on the narrow cot, their few belongings stuffed into a plastic bag at their feet. The fluorescent light above buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows across the cramped room they now called home. "When can we go back?" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's throat tightened. How could she explain that home no longer existed, that the house where he'd taken his first steps, lost his first tooth, and whispered his nighttime prayers was now a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape? That their father, the man who once pushed Tommy on swings and read bedtime stories, lay in a morgue downtown? "I don't know, sweetheart," she managed. 3 days had passed since that horrific night. 3 days of police interviews, social workers with kind eyes and clipboards, and the suffocating reality that everything they'd known had crumbled. The official story was simple. Marcus had suffered a psychotic break, attacked his family, then died of what the coroner called acute cardiac failure, brought on by extreme stress and drug use. No mention of the creature with ancient eyes who had saved their lives. Sarah touched the bandage on her neck absently. The wound had healed with remarkable speed, leaving only 2 small puncture marks that could easily be mistaken for insect bites. She'd told no one about Elias, not the police, not the counselors, not even Tommy. Who would believe such a story? The door opened with a soft knock, and Mrs. Patterson, their assigned caseworker, entered with her perpetual expression of professional sympathy. "How are we doing today?" "Fine." Sarah lied automatically. "I have some updates." Mrs. Patterson sat in the plastic chair across from them, consulting her ever-present folder. "I've found a temporary foster placement for Tommy. The Hendersons are a lovely family with experience caring for traumatized children. They have a nice home in Riverside, good schools." "No." The word escaped before Sarah could stop it. Mrs. Patterson's smile faltered slightly. "I understand this is difficult, Sarah, but you're 17. You can't care for Tommy on your own. The state requires—" "I said no." Sarah's voice grew stronger, more determined. "We stay together. Honey, I know you want to protect your brother, but you need to think practically. You have no income, no support system, no—" "We're not being separated." Sarah stood, positioning herself protectively in front of Tommy. "There has to be another way." Mrs. Patterson sighed, her practiced patience wearing thin. "There are legal processes, Sarah. I can't just ignore the system because you're upset. Tommy needs stability, structure, people who can provide for him properly." Tommy tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "I want to stay with you," he whispered. The simple words broke something inside her chest. Sarah knelt and pulled him close, feeling his small body tremble against hers. They'd already lost everything, their father to madness and violence, their mother to years of buried grief, their sense of safety and home. She wouldn't let them lose each other too. "Give us tonight," Sarah said finally. "One more night to say goodbye properly." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "The Hendersons are expecting him tomorrow afternoon. I'll pick him up at noon." She stood, gathering her papers. "I know this feels impossible right now, but you're both survivors. You'll get through this." After she left, Sarah sat in the oppressive silence, Tommy curled against her side. Outside their window, she could see the city stretching endlessly. Millions of lights, millions of people living their normal lives, oblivious to the monsters that walked among them, both the kind that saved lost children and the kind that destroyed families from within. As night deepened, Tommy finally fell asleep, exhausted by fear and uncertainty. Sarah remained awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation with Elias. He'd spoken of loneliness, of centuries spent in isolation, of the burden of being what he was. She thought about his hands, gentle despite their strength, and the way he'd looked at Tommy, not with hunger, but with something almost protective. He'd saved them. Whatever else he was, whatever dark nature drove him, he'd chosen to help when no one else would. The clock read 2:17 a.m. when she made her decision. Sarah carefully extracted herself from Tommy's sleeping form and grabbed her jacket. The shelter's security was minimal, designed more to keep people out than in. She slipped past the dozing security guard and into the cool night air. The bus ride back to their old neighborhood felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar landmark brought a fresh wave of memory and pain. As the bus rumbled through empty streets, Sarah rehearsed what she would say, how she would ask for help from a creature she barely understood. But desperation made people do impossible things. And if the monsters with fangs were kinder than the ones without them, maybe impossible was exactly what she needed. The scent of blood reached Victor before he saw the carnage. Not the rich, intoxicating aroma that usually called to his predatory nature, but something wrong, metallic and afraid, tainted with terror. He moved through the shadows toward the Hartwell house, his supernatural senses screaming warnings. The front door hung askew, splintered wood scattered across the porch like broken bones. Victor's jaw clenched as he stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on shattered glass. The living room had been destroyed with methodical violence. Furniture overturned, family photographs smashed, Clara's drawings torn and scattered like fallen leaves. "Sarah?" His voice cut through the silence, carrying the weight of centuries. No response came, only the settling sounds of a violated home. He found them in the kitchen. Sarah lay crumpled beside the overturned table, her auburn hair matted with blood from a gash across her temple. Her breathing came in shallow, pained gasps. Clara huddled in the corner, her small body trembling as she pressed herself against the cabinets, eyes wide with a trauma that would scar her for life. Victor's predatory instincts flared at the sight of blood, but something else rose stronger, a protective fury that made his fangs elongate despite his careful control. He knelt beside Sarah, his pale hands surprisingly gentle as he assessed her injuries. "Where is he?" Victor's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Hospital," Sarah managed through swollen lips. He found us, said we couldn't hide forever." Her eyes found his, pleading, "Clara, is she?" Victor turned to the child, who stared at him with recognition cutting through her terror. "Hello, little one," he said softly, the same voice he'd used when she first knocked on his door seeking help. "You're safe now." Clara's lip quivered. He hurt Mama. He was supposed to be in jail, but he came back. He was so angry. The vampire's hands clenched into fists, his supernatural strength threatening to crack the kitchen tiles beneath his knees. Marcus Hartwell had somehow made bail or escaped, or simply been released by a system that failed to understand the true nature of monsters. "Can you stand?" Victor asked Sarah, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders. She nodded weakly, allowing him to help her to her feet. Blood trickled down her face, and Victor caught himself tracking its path with unwanted hunger. He pushed the instinct down, focusing instead on the rage building in his chest, not the wild fury of a beast, but the calculated anger of a protector whose territory had been violated. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. But Sarah shook her head. "Can't. If I go to the hospital, they'll ask questions, make reports, and Marcus—" Her voice broke. He said next time he'd finish what he started. He said he'd make sure Clara watched. Victor's vision went red around the edges. In his long existence, he had witnessed humanity's capacity for both breathtaking beauty and nauseating cruelty. But this, threatening a child, terrorizing the innocent, this touched something primal in him that went beyond hunger or territory. Where would he go? The question came out like silk over steel. I don't know. Maybe his brother's place on Elm Street, or the bar downtown, Murphy's. He always... Sarah swayed, and Victor caught her before she could fall. Clara stood on unsteady legs, moving closer to them. "Mr. Victor, are you going to stop him, like you said you would?" The vampire looked down at the child, this brave little girl who had sought help from a monster because the humans around her had failed so completely. Her trust in him was both humbling and terrifying. "Yes," he said simply. He helped Sarah to the couch, checking her injuries with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen countless wounds over the centuries. Concussion, certainly, and several deep cuts that would need attention, but nothing immediately life-threatening. "Lock the doors behind me," Victor instructed, his voice already changing, taking on the cold authority of the predator he truly was. "Stay inside. Don't answer for anyone but me." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew. Victor straightened, shadows seeming to gather around him like a cloak. The careful facade of humanity he wore began to slip away, revealing glimpses of the ancient creature beneath, the apex predator who had survived centuries by being more dangerous than anything else that hunted in the dark. "I'm going to remind Marcus Hartwell that there are worse things than prison," he said. "There are worse fates than death. And there are monsters in this world who don't appreciate competition." As he turned toward the door, Clara's small voice stopped him. "Be careful, Mr. Victor." For just a moment, the monster's expression softened. "Don't worry about me, little one. Worry about what happens to bad men who hurt people I've promised to protect." The front door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid, leaving only the whisper of his promise hanging in the air. The warehouse smelled of rust and decay, shadows pooling in corners where even the weak moonlight couldn't reach. Victor stood motionless in the center of the vast space, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he waited. He had chosen this place carefully, abandoned, forgotten, far from innocent eyes that might witness what was about to unfold. Footsteps echoed against concrete, deliberate and confident. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their faces twisted with the kind of cruel satisfaction that Victor had seen countless times across centuries of human cruelty. Marcus led them, his expensive suit incongruous in the decrepit setting, flanked by 2 men whose bulging jackets suggested they came prepared for violence. "Well, well," Marcus drawled, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "The mysterious benefactor finally shows himself. I have to admit, I'm curious about what kind of bleeding heart would interfere in my family's business." Victor turned slowly, allowing the pale streetlight filtering through broken windows to illuminate his gaunt features. The men shifted uncomfortably at the sight of his colorless skin and those ancient, predatory eyes that seemed to drink in the darkness around them. "Mr. Hartwell," Victor's voice was soft, almost conversational. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." Marcus laughed, but there was an edge to it now. "Invitation? You mean your threats? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I could have you disappeared with a phone call." "Could you?" Victor tilted his head, genuinely curious. "How fascinating. And tell me, what would little Emma think of her father's methods of problem-solving?" The mention of his daughter's name sent Marcus into a rage. His face flushed red as he stepped forward, jabbing a finger at Victor. "You stay away from my family, you freak. Emma doesn't need to know about this. Once I'm done with you, Sarah, and that little brat will learn their place." Victor felt something cold and familiar stirring in his chest, the hunger that had sustained him through centuries of darkness. But alongside it was something else, something that surprised him with its intensity. The protective fury that had awakened when he first saw Lucy's tears now blazed like a furnace in his undead heart. "You speak of your daughter with such casual indifference," Victor observed, beginning to circle them with predatory grace. "Tell me, Marcus, when did you stop seeing her as a child and start seeing her as property to be controlled?" One of Marcus's companions, a thick-set man with nervous eyes, fumbled for something inside his jacket. Victor moved faster than human perception could follow, and suddenly he was standing directly behind the man, one pale hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I wouldn't," Victor whispered, his breath cold against the man's ear. "You'll want both hands free for what's coming." The man froze, every instinct screaming danger, though he couldn't quite understand why. Victor released him and stepped back, his movements fluid and otherworldly. "Here's what's going to happen," Victor announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You're going to cease all contact with Sarah and Lucy. You're going to withdraw your custody petition. and you're going to find new outlets for your need to control and terrorize, ones that don't involve innocent children." Marcus's laugh was ugly now, desperate. "Or what? You think you can intimidate me with some parlor tricks and dramatic lighting? I've dealt with scarier things than you, old man. Have you?" Victor's lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "I wonder." The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. The shadows themselves began to move, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that defied natural explanation. Victor's eyes caught what little light there was and reflected it back like a nocturnal predator's, and when he smiled fully, the gleam of fangs was unmistakable. "My name is Victor Dracul," he said, his voice now carrying the accumulated weight of 5 centuries. "And you, Marcus Hartwell, are about to learn the difference between human cruelty and something far older." The transformation was subtle but absolute. The frail, elderly man Marcus had dismissed vanished, replaced by something that radiated an aura of ancient, patient hunger. Victor's presence filled the warehouse like a physical force, pressing down on the 3 men with the weight of countless nights and endless darkness. Marcus stumbled backward, his face draining of color as primitive instincts finally overrode his arrogance. His companions flanked him, but their earlier confidence had evaporated completely. "You're insane," Marcus whispered, but his voice cracked on the words. Victor stepped closer, and each footfall seemed to echo with supernatural resonance. Perhaps 500 years of existence does tend to blur the lines of sanity, but I am also very, very protective of children who remind me of better angels in human nature. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of 3 human hearts beating far too fast, and one ancient creature, who no longer needed to breathe, preparing to remind mortal monsters why they should fear the dark. The sirens wailed through the night like dying animals, their red and blue lights painting the Hartwell house in hellish hues. Magistrate Thorne's body lay twisted on the front lawn, his neck bearing twin puncture wounds that told a story the authorities would never believe. Detective Morrison crouched beside the corpse, his weathered face grim as he studied the scene. "Same as the others," his partner muttered, snapping photographs. "Clean bite, complete exsanguination. What kind of animal are we dealing with here?" Morrison stood slowly, his joints protesting. 3 bodies in 2 weeks, all bearing identical marks. The official reports would cite wild dog attacks, but deep in his gut, he knew better. Something ancient and predatory stalked these streets. Inside the house, Sarah held Lucy tight against her chest, both of them trembling as they watched the chaos unfold beyond their windows. The child hadn't spoken since they'd found Thorne's body at dawn, her small frame racked with silent sobs that broke her mother's heart. "Is the bad man really gone, Mama?" Lucy finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the commotion outside. "Yes, sweetheart, he can't hurt us anymore." Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, marveling at how easily the words came. She should have felt horror at Thorne's death, should have been consumed with guilt over her relief. Instead, she felt only a profound sense of liberation, as if chains she'd worn for years had finally fallen away. A soft knock at the back door made them both freeze. Sarah's heart hammered as she approached cautiously, peering through the curtain. Elias stood in the shadows of the porch, his pale face etched with concern. She opened the door without hesitation, noting how he remained carefully outside the threshold. The formal invitation from weeks ago had been rescinded by Thorne's presence in their home, she realized, another barrier between them and their unlikely protector. "Are you both unharmed?" His voice carried centuries of weariness, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. "We're fine," she said, then stepped aside. "Please, come in." He crossed the threshold with visible relief, his gaze immediately finding Lucy. The child looked up at him with large, solemn eyes, no trace of fear in her expression. "Thank you," Lucy said simply, and Elias felt something twist painfully in his chest. In all his centuries of existence, no one had ever thanked him for taking a life. The irony wasn't lost on him that it took a child's gratitude to make him question everything he'd become. "You shouldn't thank me for what I am," he said quietly, kneeling to her level. "What I did tonight, you saved us." Lucy's voice carried a conviction that silenced his protests. "Mr. Thorne was going to hurt Mama. You stopped him." Through the front windows, they could see the coroner's van arriving, the efficient machinery of law enforcement processing a scene they couldn't possibly understand. Sarah watched Elias study the activity with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed countless similar scenes across the centuries. "They'll investigate," she said. "Ask questions. Let them." His tone was flat, unconcerned. "They'll find no evidence pointing to anything beyond their comprehension. They never do." The casual confidence in his voice sent a chill through Sarah. How many times had he done this? How many bodies had he left in his wake over the centuries? The thought should have terrified her, should have made her gather Lucy and run. Instead, she found herself studying his profile in the dim light, noting the way exhaustion seemed to weigh on his immortal shoulders. "What happens now?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his ancient mind processing possibilities and consequences. Thorne's death would create ripples, questions, investigations, attention he couldn't afford. More concerning was the growing attachment he felt to this small family, an emotional vulnerability he hadn't experienced in centuries. "Now you rebuild," he said finally. "Thorne's influence dies with him. The legal threats, the financial pressure, it all ends here. And you?" The question escaped before Sarah could stop it. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something flickering in his dark eyes. Want, longing, fear, the face of a creature who had forgotten what it meant to hope for something beyond survival. "I should leave," he said, but made no move toward the door. "My presence here brings danger. What you are saved my daughter's life," Sarah interrupted. "What you are gave us back our home, our future." Lucy moved closer to him, her small hand reaching out to touch his cheek. He went perfectly still, like a wild animal, uncertain whether to flee or lean into the contact. Her palm was warm against his cold skin, a reminder of everything human he'd lost. "Don't go," she whispered, "please." Outside, the sirens began to fade as the last of the emergency vehicles departed, leaving only the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood settling into sleep. But inside the Hartwell house, an ancient vampire found himself facing the most terrifying prospect of his long existence, the possibility of belonging somewhere. The scent of blood hung heavy in the air as Victor stood over Marcus Dalton's broken form. The man's breathing came in ragged gasps, his expensive suit torn and stained crimson. Around them, the abandoned warehouse echoed with the sounds of approaching sirens. Tommy had done exactly as instructed. "Please," Marcus wheezed, his hand reaching desperately toward Victor's feet. "I can pay you whatever you want, money, property, anything." Victor crouched down, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom and weariness. "What I want, Mr. Dalton, is something you've never understood. The difference between power and strength, between fear and respect." The vampire's fangs had retracted, his monstrous visage replaced by something almost human, almost gentle. Yet the predator still lurked beneath, contained but not eliminated. "You terrorized a child, you destroyed a family, you believed your wealth made you untouchable." Marcus tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and Victor could hear the irregular rhythm of internal bleeding. The man was dying, slowly but inevitably. "The boy came to me," Victor continued, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. "A frightened child seeking help from the neighborhood boogeyman because even a monster seemed safer than you." He stood, brushing dust from his coat. He was right. The sirens grew louder. Victor had perhaps 3 minutes before the first responders arrived. He glanced toward the warehouse entrance where shadows shifted, his escape route already planned. But something held him in place, something he hadn't felt in decades. Regret. Not for what he'd done to Marcus Dalton, but for what he'd almost become again. The hunger had risen during their confrontation, the old bloodlust singing in his veins. For a moment, he'd wanted to tear out the man's throat, to feel warm blood cascade down his chin. The monster had stirred, eager to reclaim its dominion. Instead, he'd chosen restraint, calculated violence over savage feeding, protection over predation. Why? Marcus gasped, his eyes dimming. Why do this for them? Victor considered the question. Why had he intervened? Why risk exposure for a human family he barely knew? The answer came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over centuries of darkness. Because, he said softly, someone must draw the line between necessary evil and senseless cruelty, because monsters who choose to be better are still better than humans who choose to be worse. He could hear voices now, police radios crackling in the distance. Time to leave. But as Victor turned toward the shadows, Marcus spoke one final time. The boy, what happens when he learns what you really are? The question struck deeper than any stake. Victor paused, considering Tommy's trusting eyes, his innocent gratitude. What would happen when the child discovered his savior was a creature of nightmare, when he learned that the gentle guardian who'd protected his family was also the predator parents used to frighten children into obedience? Perhaps, Victor murmured, more to himself than to the dying man, he'll understand that monsters aren't born from fangs and darkness, but from choices, from deciding that power gives one the right to hurt the innocent. He melted into the shadows just as flashlight beams swept across the warehouse floor. The police would find Marcus Dalton's body, along with carefully planted evidence of his crimes, financial records, photographs, testimonies from other victims that Victor had collected over the past week. The official story would paint a picture of justice finally catching up with a predator. Victor emerged into the cool night air 3 blocks away, his supernatural senses tracking the organized chaos behind him. Police cars, ambulances, crime scene technicians, all the machinery of human justice grinding into motion. He thought of Sarah Chen, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, her children safe in their beds. He thought of Tommy, brave little Tommy, who dared to seek help from darkness itself. The boy would read about Marcus Dalton's death in tomorrow's papers, would understand that his desperate gamble had paid off. But would he suspect the truth? Would he piece together the timeline? Remember the strange, pale man who'd listened to his story with such intensity? Victor found himself hoping the boy would remain innocent of that knowledge, at least for now. Let Tommy believe in anonymous justice, in a world where good occasionally triumphed without terrible cost. Let him grow up a little more before learning that sometimes salvation wore a monster's face. The vampire walked through empty streets toward his sanctuary, leaving behind the scent of blood and the weight of choices made. Tomorrow night would bring new challenges, new decisions between the hunger that defined him and the humanity he'd chosen to protect. For tonight, though, he'd proven something to himself, that centuries of darkness couldn't completely extinguish the capacity for light, that even monsters could choose to be guardians. That perhaps redemption was possible, one protected innocent at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hartwell estate as Detective Morrison stood in the grand foyer surveying the scene that would perplex investigators for decades to come. 3 bodies lay in perfect formation. Richard Hartwell sprawled near his study, his brother Marcus crumpled at the foot of the marble staircase, and their enforcer Davies twisted unnaturally by the shattered French doors. Each bore identical wounds, 2 precise punctures at the throat, drained completely of blood. "Strangest damn thing I've ever seen," Morrison muttered to his partner, crouching beside Richard's corpse. "No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. It's like they just let it happen." What the detective couldn't see were the final moments, how Richard had welcomed his death with tears of relief, how Marcus had whispered apologies to shadows, how Davies had simply closed his eyes and accepted judgment. The vampire had given each man a choice in their final seconds, fight and suffer or embrace the peace of ending. All 3 had chosen peace. Miles away, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of a modest house. where Sarah Chen hummed softly while preparing breakfast. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows, and for the first time in months, her hands didn't shake as she cracked eggs into a bowl. Tommy sat at the small table, sketching in a new notebook. Not the violent images that had filled his previous drawings, but a simple house with windows full of light. "Mom, when will we know for sure?" he asked without looking up from his drawing. Sarah paused in her cooking, understanding immediately what he meant. The question had haunted them both since that night when their world had shifted on its axis. "I think we already do, sweetheart. Sometimes you just feel when something bad is really over." She was right, though she couldn't explain the certainty that had settled in her bones. The phone calls had stopped. The car that used to park across the street had vanished. Even the shadows seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the very air around their home. Tommy nodded and returned to his drawing, adding careful flowers to the garden he'd sketched. "Do you think he's okay, the man who helped us?" Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her throat, remembering pale skin and ancient eyes filled with an impossible gentleness. "I think he's exactly where he needs to be." In the basement of the old Victorian house, Elias Blackthorne lay in his ornate coffin as the day claimed him. But even in the death-like sleep of his kind, he dreamed. Not the usual nightmares of centuries past, faces of victims, rivers of spilled blood, the weight of countless sins. Instead, he dreamed of a child's brave voice in the darkness, of a mother's fierce love, of the moment he'd chosen protection over predation. The hunger that had driven him for 8 centuries had changed. It still existed, it always would, but it no longer controlled him. 3 evil men had satisfied more than just his physical needs. Their deaths had somehow nourished something in his soul he'd thought long dead. Purpose, redemption, the possibility that even monsters could choose their own nature. As evening approached and consciousness slowly returned to his ancient form, Elias felt a presence at the edge of his property. Not threatening, curious. He rose from his resting place and moved with supernatural silence through his house, peering through heavy curtains to see a small figure standing just beyond his gate. Elias watched the boy for several minutes, torn between the desire to remain hidden and an unexpected warmth at seeing the child safe and whole. Finally, he opened the front door, careful to stay in the shadows. "You shouldn't be here alone after dark," he called softly. Tommy looked up, his face breaking into a shy smile. "I wanted to give you something." He held up the drawing. "And to say thank you, really thank you." The vampire moved closer, still keeping to the darkness between streetlights. "Your mother doesn't know you're here. She knows I needed to come. She said sometimes brave people need to know they're not alone." Elias felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening. In 8 centuries of existence, no one had ever considered him worth thanking, worth remembering with anything but fear. The drawing fluttered slightly in Tommy's small hands, and Elias could see the care the boy had put into every line. "You are very brave, Thomas Chen," he said quietly. "Both you and your mother." "So are you," Tommy replied with the simple honesty of childhood. The scary kind of brave, but still brave. As the boy walked back toward safety and light, leaving the drawing tucked carefully by the gate, Elias understood that some transformations happen not in grand moments, but in small acts of recognition. He was still a monster. Would always be a monster. But perhaps monsters, too, could learn to be guardians. The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities he'd never dared imagine.